Yeah, that's perfect. We can see that now. Yeah.
Perfect. So I guess, firstly, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Johnny. I've been sailing full rig or sailing lasers probably from when I was around kind of 14. I think I started 13 or 14. I started 4.7 sailing, and then kind of from then graduated. I went from Oppies into the 4.7 and then did a year in 29ers and then went back to radials, and then from radials graduated into full rigs when I was 17. So just when I was finishing youth sailing, I kind of made the jump into full rigs, and kind of joined like the Olympic training kind of team for about a year, and then kind of took a step back from the Olympic side of things, and kind of I've kept racing since on the like national level, the nationals, the Munsters, and those sort of events. So I've kind of been through this transition a little bit before. So I guess I'm kind of talking from my own experience a lot, and kind of the kind of general issues that people have when they're making the jump, because it can be difficult. It's a lot bigger sail than a radial compared to the jump from a 4.7 to a radial. But look, we'll get through it. If there's any questions at all, feel free to stop me during it, or I've allowed some time as well at the end for questions. So but feel free to stop me. I'm happy to kind of keep it as quite chatty, rather than me just like waffling on, lecturing to all of you. So try to get on to the next. There we go. So basically, just really quickly, probably most of you probably know this already. Just kind of comparing the two rigs. The radial, obviously, for most guys, probably stop sailing the laser or the radial around kind of 17, 18, 16, just depending on size. And obviously, the girls stay at it then. But I mean, it's not. I wouldn't say it's imperative that as a guy that you jump into full rigs. There's still quite a competitive radial rig. If you are kind of less than 75 kilos, it's probably a pretty difficult boat to sail at less than that, especially when you're kind of up over the kind of 10 or 12 knot range. Coming against the likes of Nick, like you'd be getting rolled pretty quickly. But yeah, if people graduate on, so as you can see, the change in the sail area is pretty substantial, considering a 4.7 to a radial is only an extra meter of sail area compared to the radial is an extra 1.5 almost. So it's a big jump. The kind of youngest people you'd see in full rigs are usually probably around 15, but I think that's more of a weight thing, and kind of people kind of tend to move on with their friends. I know that was kind of a big part of it for me. Was my last year in radials. I probably didn't enjoy as much because a few of my friends had moved up to full rigs. So I was quite keen to go. Then looking at the full rig, then it's probably with the new Mark II sail, the optimum weight for them is around 85 kilos. But I think you can be competitive really probably from 75 up, right up to 95 or even more. You'd see all right. So yeah. So again, just quite quickly, changing over from the radial to the full rig, there's a few changes to be made. Obviously, it goes without saying, a different sail and a different bottom section, the same way the sail changes from a 4.7 to a radial. Probably one of the most important things that you see a lot of the kind of new full rig sailors make is the length of their kicker. So the gap between the kicker, what you can see in this picture is like the cleat on the mast and the gooseneck, or where the boom connects to the mast, is a little bit longer in a standard than it is on a radial. So you have people going standard sailing for their first time and their kicker is too tight, so it's maxing out too soon, and their leech is too tight downwind, and it can also almost make it difficult to get the sail rigged and get your clew on. So it's really important. If you can see it there, is that the block on the kicker is right up next to the boom, and there's very little like dyneema coming out of the block that attaches to the boom. So that means that when you're pulling your kicker on, you're using all of the purchase, and you see people sometimes with it kind of like halfway along, and when they pull the kicker on, it goes block to block. too soon, and they can't get enough kicker on going upwind. So that's probably the biggest mistake you see in terms of rigging when people are new to the full rig. So it's definitely something just to watch out for. I know it definitely caught me out when I first started full rig sailing. After that, what a lot of people are running now is an 8-to-1 downhaul, which is basically an extra up and down from your usual radial or 4.7 setup. I know some of the radial sailors are starting to use it now. And it's just, that's mostly because the new Mark II sail has it's made a kind of less stretchy material and has a slightly shorter leap or luff. So there's a lot more downhaul to be pulled on, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then the last thing is just that the battens, again, on this new Mark II sail are different to the battens that carry over from the 4.7 to the radial. And those same battens will carry into the older style full rig sails, but they're different lengths and different shapes to the new Mark II sails, and they just won't fit in the batten pocket. So that's, again, just something to look out for if you're changing. So here, this is the new downhaul. You can get it in any chandlery. You can make it yourself if you've a block at home, just to tie on to your current system. So can you see my mouse there on the screen?
Yeah, we can see your mouse. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that top block there is just your kind of normal system, and it's just really simple. You tie a second block on and just run the rope up and down one more time. You put on an extra block at the bottom as well, and just makes it easier to get the downhaul on, because the downhaul is I would say probably the most important control in the full rig, whereas in a radial it's probably the kicker is probably more important, but the downhaul really depowers the sail a lot. And then the other thing that you can do is this Dyneema line here, or you can see the Dyneema here. When you're running it, you can run it on the same side as the primary line. You can run both lines on the same side of the boom. Whereas in this picture, it's going around that side of the boom, the far side. It means that the eye of the mainsail will only go as far as the boom when you put the downhaul on, which is fine if your sail is quite new. But once the sail gets a little bit older, they start to stretch, especially the full rig sails really start to stretch quite a bit. So you will need to be getting the eye down to the boom or even past the boom. So that's pretty important. Again, something to watch out for. It's probably not going to be the biggest difference in the world when you're just beginning, but it is something that over time you will start to see. You'll see some guy going upwind and the eye of his mainsail will be down way past the boom, and you'll be wondering why he's going quicker than you, and that's probably the reason. So here, that's just this is kind of, you see the effect of the downhaul here, and it's obviously when you pull the Cunningham on or the downhaul, it's tightening all the luff of the sail, and it's also pulling the draft, which is the deepest part of the sail, which usually sits around here where my cursor is. When you're pulling that forward, when you're pulling the downhaul on, it's moving that draft forward, which then helps you to basically helps the boat to bear away and keep speed rather than constantly trying to point up. I think you'll figure this out pretty quickly when you move on, because in a full rig, what you get a lot is you feel like you're constantly pulling the tiller towards you, and your arm is almost tired by the end of the day because you're just wrecked from constantly trying to make the boat bear away. And that's probably a pretty key sign that either one, your boat's not flat, but secondly, that you probably don't have enough downhaul on, and that's then what's preventing you from just getting that bow down and kind of keeping the boat nice and balanced. So you can see here the boat's reasonably flat. The tiller's pretty much center line, and I think a lot of that is down to just the fact that downhaul is really tight. And to be honest, it looks like it could probably be a little bit tighter, judging off these little creases here. You could really get it on a bit more. But again, that much downhaul just really probably wouldn't be possible without this kind of the upgrade. So yeah, there's that one. And then so we move on. I know I've probably mentioned the Mark II and the Mark I sail a lot. To be honest, it's starting off, it definitely doesn't matter which one you have. And I would probably go as far to say as the only time it does really matter which one you have is maybe if you're a slightly heavier sailor, kind of north of 85 or 86 kilos. And other than that, if you're Finlynch or one of these Olympic guys where it's kind of all in those really, really marginal gains. I think at probably national level or club, definitely club racing level, kind of the difference between the two is minimal. It's probably more of a psychological thing than anything. I know in the Monkstown League every winter, there's probably a lot more people using Mark I sails, and they're just as capable of winning races as the lads with the Mark II sails. So quickly enough, the Mark I sail is kind of the traditional full rig sail that you'd see. This might make it a little bit clearer. Just the one on the left there is kind of what you used to see up until probably 2 or 3 years ago. 2 years ago when they brought in the Mark II sail. So it's as I said earlier, it uses the same battens as the 4.7 and the radial, and it actually is quite a good bit flatter than the new Mark II sail, and so it would suit a lighter sailor. Kind of. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. It would suit a lighter sailor because it's a bit flatter, and that's kind of all to do with the reason. Another reason the new downhaul is important on the Mark II sails is to kind of take some of that depth that has been given to the Mark II sail and get it back closer to a Mark I sail. But definitely, if you're on the lighter side of full rig sailing, like 75, 78 kilos, I would probably go as far to say you should be using the Mark I sail as often as you can, or if you can get your hands on one. I know you still see a few brand new ones available secondhand, and there's just after that they're everywhere. So they're pretty easy to come by, and definitely if you're just starting full rig sailing, it's a great sail to get quite cheap, and just kind of have a go in the boat, kind of see what it's like. Try and figure out if you prefer your radial or if you prefer your full rig. Then the newer Mark II sail, obviously there's probably less of them available secondhand, but they also last a bit longer. They're made of a thicker, heavier material, which in fairness, it's quite exciting the first day you go out because you definitely notice a bit of a difference. And as I said, that's a picture of their battens there in the top right corner. So they're quite different. But again, probably the difference between the two, if you had two boats going in a straight line upwind, is probably minimal enough, unless you're really, really both guys are doing everything perfect. Maybe the new one is probably going to be a little bit faster, but usually there's probably a few more variables that would get you in trouble before you're getting worried about your sail. So there you can see the two of them there, and it's a lot easier to kind of play with the shape of the newer one on the right. More so because of there's a lot more panels. So all of these kind of lines, each one is a different panel, and those panels will kind of move a little bit more independently of each other compared to the old full rig sail, which only had about 5 panels, and each one kind of they would move, and that whole panel would kind of take a general shape. Whereas in the Mark II sails, it can change around definitely a little bit more. So jumping on then, we'll kind of just get into kind of the full rig tips. These are kind of things that I took from my own experience, both like they might seem quite basic, but at the same time, they're kind of essential no matter what level you're sailing full rigs at or sailing lasers at. But they're definitely the biggest things that I noticed going from radial sailing to full rig sailing. So this picture actually is me on my very first day full rig sailing, and I went out with my kicker set like as if I'd been radial sailing. So as you can see here, the block is pretty much maxed fully out because I had it way too tight, because I just come back from a radial event and I said I'll just use the same kicker, everything should be fine. And as you can see, like if you're looking at my boom, I'm also running way too much kicker. Like booms shouldn't bend like an S hook, and they most certainly do in the full rig compared to the radial. So that's kind of my first point there, is just compared to the radial, whereas in going upwind in 20 knots in the radial, you're trying to just hang everything you can out of the kicker and get as much of it on as possible. And what that does is it really just bends the mast. Compared to in the full rig, it's the Cunningham that bends the mast. And the Vang, you're kind of just, you're obviously, you're getting it tight to keep that tension in the leech, but it's definitely more of a secondary control compared to how important your downhaul is. And again, that's really kind of just emphasizing the 8-to-1 downhaul upgrade for the Mark II sails, that I think if you are going to do a bit of full rig sailing, it's definitely worth investing in. You'll be thanking yourself for it on windier days. But that's the main thing. And then the best thing that I felt to kind of know what to do with the kicker was I put marks on the Dyneema part. So if I go back to this picture, I put marks just along this line here, the one that feeds into this top block. And then that I just used that to judge then how much kicker I had on. And it's also really good if you can get a friend that you're sailing with all the time to do the same thing, and one person is faster one day, you're faster the next day, and you get to see after every speed test or every day, you say, oh, I was kind of like on my 3rd mark down, and they were like, oh, well, I was way down on my 5th mark. And then it's kind of just a really simple, straightforward way to come in from sailing and straight away know that something was a little bit off. But again, if you are going to do that, you want to make sure you know the person and that your marks are in the same place. Otherwise, you end up with a pointless exercise. So then, when we're talking about sailing downwind in the full rig, the angle wise, it's much the same as a radial. You want to be sailing either by the lee or on a broad reach. The boat becomes, since the sail is heavier and the sail is taller, you get a lot more riding moment moving around at the top of the rig. So it's definitely a lot less stable than the radial downwind, and you learn that pretty quickly. Probably learned it the hard way, unfortunately, but you do get used to it over time. And then if you do step back into a radial, it'll feel very, very tame in comparison. But the most stable ways of sailing downwind, definitely not straight downwind. Personally, I always found sailing by the lee, especially if it was really, really windy, just bearing away by the lee and just hanging on to be really the most stable, because you're in so much control over the boat. And if you do get a little bit rocky, all you have to do is just kind of maybe point up a little bit, get a little bit closer to dead downwind, and pull the main sheet in a little bit more, and that should stable you right out. Versus I think when you're broad reaching, you can kind of go between hiking to death rolling very quickly, because you're trying to lean out to keep the boat flat, and then suddenly you overdo it and you end up death rolling. So yeah, again, your kicker marks as well that we just talked about could come in handy a lot, even for downwind sailing. Just knowing where your kicker is set at for sailing by the lee. But definitely heading downwind, in terms of, especially when you're beginning, sailing by the lee is a way, way more comfortable way to sail downwind when you're just getting used to it, especially when it's windy. And after that, you can kind of gradually, you'll get to know the boundaries, and you'll also really notice that when you do point kind of straight downwind, that you can sometimes get away within a radial. You really feel it in the full rig. Everything just starts to get a little bit wishy-washy. You don't really know if you're speeding up or slowing down. There's boats sailing around you like there's no tomorrow. It's probably, the diagram kind of only goes so far, whereas kind of actually your first day out, kind of doing it, or your second day, you'll old habits, straight downwind, and just straight away you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, by the lee, I probably couldn't recommend it anymore to someone, especially starting out. So that picture there, top right, is probably someone who was kind of attempting by the lee and had the sail a little bit too far out, or the Vang a little bit too far off. And for anyone, I'd say probably most radial sailors as well, even though this guy's kind of feeling in this moment that there's not a whole lot that can be done to kind of save the situation, unfortunately. But that is kind of the nature of the beast that is the full rig. As I said, the taller mast with the heavier sail does make things more unstable. The leech as well, it's probably my fourth point here. The leech is a lot longer than in a radial. And as a result, it stretches a lot more. So you get a much bigger changes when a gust does come on and that your leech opens up. And it really does get rocky quite quickly. But again, it's the more time you sail in the boat, the more stable and the more natural it'll feel. But as I said, if you are by the lee and you are unstable, the way to go is just a little bit more kicker, pull in the main sheet, and that should make everything that bit more stable anyway. It's still definitely going to feel a lot more unstable than the radial when you're starting off. But as I said, you'll definitely get used to it. And then if you just look at this bottom picture, kind of again, a little bit of explaining in this one, but in terms of just showing you kind of the instability is if you look at this guy's body positioning, all his weight is on the leeward side of the boat. And if you were to do that in a radial, the boat would just heel to leeward and start to point up. Whereas here in the full rig, because his leech is open and he's sailing by the lee now, is the kind of mast wants to push to windward. All that flow, so the breeze is coming in from the back of the mainsail, flowing towards the front, rather than if you were broad reaching, it would be flowing from the front to the back. So if you think about it, the wind is coming from over here where the cursor is now, and that's pushing the whole boat over on top of him. So you can see his weight's all the way in and the boat is just flat and sailing fast. And that's really fast in the full rig, like really, really fast. But again, it comes with instability, but over time it becomes natural. And that kicker position is probably pretty much his max off. I would say it's maybe a little bit too loose, but it's max off. But that max off is going to be very different to what your max off is in 25 knots. So that again is where the marks on your kicker come into their own straight away, because you can go around the top mark and say, right, I'm letting the kicker off to the fourth mark, not the fifth mark, and it's done. Set for the downwind, and you're happy out by the lee, sailing along while everyone else is there trying to fiddle with it. So that's definitely probably, especially starting off, really one of the things you can use to make a really big difference. And I think it applies as well to even if you are doing a lot of full rig sailing or you've been sailing full rigs for a long time. It's probably a small thing that not a lot of people have, and it can just make your life like a hell of a lot easier. If you know going around the mark that I need to go to mark 4, then happy days, and off you go. So another kind of drill that I'd probably think would be a really good one to do if you're kind of just new to full rigs or trying to get used to the balance. And this again probably applies to people who have been sailing full rigs for quite a while. I know this was something that I did pretty much every day I went sailing when I went downwind, was just tying the tiller just here, as you can see where his tiller is there, just tying it loosely to your tow strap or to the traveller cleat at the back of the cockpit. And that teaches you let the tiller go, and then straight away the boat is turning based on what the sail and what the heel of the boat is doing. And it teaches you kind of, first of all, how the boat's feeling, because you're not able to counteract the feeling of the boat with your tiller because it's tight. So really the steering is just listening to what the sail and what the boat are telling it. So it's really good. Obviously it's a very simple principle. You lean in and pull the main sheet in to point up, and you lean out and leave the main sheet out to bear away. But like here in this guy's picture right now, he's leaning to leeward, meaning in theory the boat should point up, but he's probably actually only leaning to leeward so much that he's balancing the amount of sail that's trying to death roll or trying to capsize to windward. So it's, even though he's leaning quite hard to leeward, the boat is probably, or looks to me to be pretty perfectly balanced. Whereas the top guy definitely kind of waited a little bit too long, and as you can see, his tiller is probably not doing much for him there. But that's a really good drill that I think everyone sailing, even 4.7s or radials, can do all the time, but definitely something that it becomes much more important when you're in the full rig and you've got a bigger sail kind of throwing you around the place, and your angles are definitely more important to avoid getting stuck in that straight downwind mode. So yeah, few other kind of small points just to probably note about the full rig. Obviously, compared to a radial, you're hiking a lot earlier, especially that bigger sail. You can power it up really easily. So you're probably hiking, if you're on the light side, kind of down around 78 kilos, you're probably you're definitely gently hiking in probably 6.5, 7 knots, and flat out hiking in probably as little as 9, really. So they can be kind of long enough, painful enough days on the legs. But there's a lot more hiking, and that becomes really important. I know some of you might know, some of you might not know Chef Guilfoyle, who won a silver medal at the ISAF Youth Worlds, and went on then to full rig sailing, and pretty much just did too much of it too soon, with maybe kind of a hiking position that he'd kind of been comfortable with in radials, but just wasn't really kind of, all the long days training, light for the boat, doing more hiking than anybody else. And sure enough, he ended up with a pretty bad back injury that left him not able to sail for the best part of a year. But again, pretty extreme example, given that he was sailing probably a couple of days a week, every single week. But it really does show how important it is, the hiking position is, because you're doing it all the time. If you're coming out of radials at 78 kilos, you're only hiking when it's 14 or 15 knots, and before that you're kind of just leaning out. So kind of how I used to always remember kind of the optimum hiking position was just try and lift my hips up, lift my chest up, like puff my chest out, and try to point my toes. And after that, everything kind of seems to follow suit. Your head stays up, your legs stay reasonably straight when your toes are pointed and your hips are up. And then obviously your area from your hips to your chest just stays up when your chest is lifted, and then you're kind of getting maximum leverage. That's probably the tallest I've ever looked hiking. It was probably in the first 15 seconds of the speed test, because after that I'd say my legs were ready to go. But another thing kind of to note is, again, with all this like additional hiking that you get in a full rig, is you want to hike really consistently. Like, you're kind of thinking, okay, it's going to be a 12-minute upwind. So like, really, with the exception of maybe the first minute of the race, when you're going to be hiking quite hard off the line to kind of keep your lane or keep your position, after that, it's going to be a case of, okay, I've got another 9 or 10 minutes upwind, or maybe if it's an Irish event, it's a little bit shorter, maybe another 7 or 8 minutes upwind. And you need to just be thinking, okay, like what position can I hold for the next 6 or 7 minutes at least? And it can't be like I'm going to hike with my hips up, my chest up, and my toes fully pointed. I'm going to hike as hard as I can. And like, that's brilliant. But if it's only for 20 seconds and then you need to take a 20-second break, it's no good. And it can be hard to do if you see kind of someone like one of the Olympic lads like Liam or Ewan or Finn sailing off in the distance with their perfect hiking position. But I mean, the best way to catch them is by hiking consistently, and not by 20 seconds on and 20 seconds off, because that's also not really how you build like hiking stamina. And if you are sailing every week, hiking at 75% of your max for 8 minutes at a time, gradually your max will increase, and suddenly you'll be able to hike. Your 75% will be hiking a lot harder than it was a few weeks ago, and you'll notice that quickly. But again, it's really important just to be wary, I suppose, of making sure your back is reasonably straight and not overarched, or that you're not hunched up in a ball, because you can end up, if you're hiking all day for a full weekend, you can end up doing a little bit of damage. After that, once you are hiking, what becomes important then is, again, a bigger sail. Naturally, a bigger sail basically is affected more by wind than a smaller sail, because there's more. It's got a greater surface area. So that makes the boat balance and your sail trim really, really important. So when you're going upwind, you're really aiming to try and have a really consistent heel. So you're consistent hiking and your consistent heel. It doesn't need to be dead flat. If you want your bum to sag down a little bit in your little kind of 30-second breaks when they do come after your 8 minutes, or in your little 5-second breaks or 2-second breaks, you can do that. And the boat doesn't need to be dead flat. It just needs to be consistently heeled. So like in this picture, the boat's probably heeled at maybe 5 degrees or 10 degrees. And that's fine as long as you're keeping it. Because if you think about it, if the boat is swaying from side to side, you're getting a lot of disturbances at the top of the mast, because 2 centimeters at the bottom is magnified at the top, and the same for your foils, which are giving you grip in the water. And you definitely notice that. Well, I anyway noticed that an awful lot more compared to radials, especially, you know, in towards the end of my radial sailing, I was probably right up at like 77, 78, 79 kilos. And it was a case of the gust could come and I pretty much just kind of stretch my shoulders out a little bit more, tense my legs a little bit more, and the boat would pretty much stay flat. I wouldn't really need to do you kind of get lazy, you know, as a bigger radial sailor, you get a bit lazy. So, you know, if that's kind of background you are moving into the full rig from, it's definitely kind of worthwhile just keeping it as a point to note for when you are going upwind or going sailing, that, like, you know, I just need to be a little bit extra on it today with trimming and seeing the gust and just letting your sail out a second before the gust. Whereas in a radial, you could probably get away with a little bit more forgiveness and let it out kind of as the gust hits, or even a little bit later. It definitely teaches you to be a bit more alert to your trimming and to your hiking. So yeah, as I said, last point, a lot more weight higher up in the rig, and that makes tacking and jibing easier, especially when it's windy. Tacking when it's windy, you really want to have a lot of speed going into it so that you don't end up stuck head to wind, because there's a lot more sail flapping than in a radial. Thankfully, you probably don't have as much of a problem getting under the boom, because the boom is a little bit higher. And then the extra sail area and the extra weight in the rig, obviously it makes the boat more unbalanced, but that then in turn in lighter winds makes the boat a lot easier to roll tack and roll jibe. It almost rolls accidentally and you're trying to just race the boom across, where especially versus a radial or 4.7, where it takes a little bit more oomph to get the heel in the boat. So there's Nick there in the background smiling away. Kind of a perfect guide to illustrate the point here is that, you know, my first day laser sailing was Nick was in the rib. I was 13 with his son and my brother and a bunch of other Oppie kids. And sure enough, I think probably 4 or 5 years later, we were racing on the same start line together in a full rig. And Nick was by no means towards the oldest in the fleet. I think probably that title will probably go to Dennis O'Sullivan at the time, who was, I think, a great grandmaster, or a great grandmaster, a class legend in Ireland. But it's really, that's probably one of my favorite things about it, is kind of you have people who are kind of sailing. You have some people who are new to sailing. You have people who have been sailing years and they're just happy to get out laser sailing at the weekend. You've kind of people who had done loads of sailing and now do less, so weekend warriors. You know, you have the likes of Fionn Lydon or Finn Lynch, and they're there. And everyone's racing together. Everyone's having a good time. And you definitely learn quite a lot, because you're sailing against some really good, really experienced sailors. Like Nick probably has, you know, we'll say 20 years laser sailing experience, but I know it could be a bit more. I just don't want to reveal his age. And again, it's a boat that you can buy a laser now, and, you know, a laser will still be a laser in 10 years time, or in 15 years time. It'll still get you around the course if it's looked after properly. And I think that makes it really attractive versus some other classes where you're constantly upgrading the whole time, like an ORS or a Moth or things like that. And I guess the last point, I know Nick mentioned kind of local sailing in Cork earlier on, and I guess what I really enjoy doing, especially, like, obviously it didn't happen this year, but like during 6th year when I was really not doing a lot of sailing, was the Monkstown Winter League. I think we had about 20 boats on the start line most of the weeks, between 15 and 20. Get out 3 races against all sorts of people. You have, I think we had Darragh O'Sullivan, who was kind of just after doing his, like the trial for the Rio Olympics. And you had beginners, you had everyone in between, and it's great fun. And I think Hoth has a similar thing going on through the winter frostbites, and it's a great thing to get you through the winter, as well as kind of get you a little bit prepared for what is usually the first event in Baltimore for the Munsters. But mostly it's full rig sailing is really, really enjoyable. It's very social, it's very fun, and you can kind of take it as seriously as you want, and it's good crack. So yeah, that's pretty much all from me, I think. If there are any questions, work away, and I guess if not, no problem.
Great, Johnny. Thanks for that. Yeah, that gave us a good rundown of the differences between the radial and the standard rig. Thanks again. There's a few questions, and I suppose I'll bring one up here because, I can add to this one as well, because I've been threatening to mark my kicker for the past probably 10 years and I haven't done it yet, but I'll get there. What do you use to mark the kicker? Tape, thread, or a marker?
You've named all 3 options. So definitely you've put some thought into it at least. The easiest thing, I would probably go out with tape the first time, because you can move it around. A marker is there forever, and thread can just be a bit of a pain. So maybe a day or two with tape, and kind of, roughly where the marks need to go, and then after that a marker or thread. The most important thing is that you can see it from where you're hiking, and you're not kind of looking in at trying to figure out, is that Mark 2 or Mark 3, because one of the marks is faded or something like that. So just as long as you can see it, it doesn't really matter too much. But probably marker, and you might have to go over it once every 2 weeks or once every month.
Very good. Okay, so something that you can see easily and quickly.
Yeah.
So you can see exactly where your kicker is when you're going along. Kevin Doyle has a question for us. Will a 6-to-1 downhaul be okay for the standard rig? 6-to-1.
It will, for sure. It'll get you out sailing and everything. If you're using the Mark II sail, I really do think it is handy to have the H1. I think, is the 6-to-1 this normal one, or is 4-to-1 the normal one?
I think the standard is usually a 6-to-1.
It's 6, and the extra up and down will be 8. So
you can go.
Yeah, it'll definitely, with a Mark I sail, I would say it's completely fine. And with one of the newer sails, I think, kind of, if you're going to be sailing a good bit through the season, it just makes your life that bit easier in heavier winds.
Let's get it down quickly as well. Another question coming in here from Connor. Could you talk about the traveller tension and how you go about adjusting it according to the wind strength? Would you adjust the traveller at all? Is there any difference? I doubt you do it in radial. Would you do it in a standard rig? Probably not.
My thinking with the traveller most of the time was have it as just as tight as I could, with the exception of if it was a little bit, like it was definitely roll tacking and roll jibing for the whole race, and it was so tight that when you were tacking or jibing, your traveller block was getting stuck in your tiller. Then it is probably too tight, because that's not really very ideal that you have to then tack or jibe and then go back and kind of flick it across with your hand. So my kind of guidance would probably be to have it as tight as you can if there's wind, and if it's light, just let it off so much that it'll cross the boat easily, but still as tight as possible.
It doesn't get caught in your tiller if it's coming through as well. Yeah, just okay. There's a few more questions, but actually I have one question for you as well, just going back to the Mark I and Mark II sails. The Mark I sail that's been the sail for years up until a few years ago. And then they brought out a Mark II sail just to basically, just to have a better sail, was it? To give it a bit more.
Yeah, the kind of Olympic guys, I think the decision was kind of geared towards them, because they were paying whatever it is for sale, like 600 or 700 quid, and it was lasting an event. And then it was kind of like, these guys put their sails through a lot of stress. Like a windy day, those guys are pulling out of their controls, and basically their sales were just lasting only an event, and it was too expensive. So the idea was that these newer sales would last a bit longer, which they definitely do. But I'm sure at that level they're probably still complaining. They'd always find something to complain about, really.
And at the same time they changed the Mark II sail, they also brought out a carbon top section, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
So do you find any difference with that between the carbon and the standard top section on either a radial or a standard rig?
I think in the radial you could probably get away with either, depending on like it basically the main difference was just that the aluminium ones eventually bent, whereas carbon, you won't be able to bend it enough that it stays bent, so it'll either come back straight or it'll have snapped. And so far I haven't heard of anyone snapping the carbon top sections. I know when I got mine, it was kind of within 100 grams of what the aluminium weighs, the average aluminium one weighed. So I think in terms of weight, they're much the same. And from what I've been able to see from my own sailing, the difference in the bend is minimal. Pretty much like they act the same way, and the only difference is that after a few days punishment, a few windy days, that your aluminium one might have a little bit of bend in it, versus your carbon one should still be straight.
So basically the new equipment coming out is making the boats a little bit tougher, a bit more hard wearing.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Again, the Olympic guys were probably going through top sections like one per event or one per two events, so more stuff to complain about.
Indeed. And there's always an aluminium top section breaking in some race.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ruin a sail, and
I think we've all been there. If you've done a couple of years laser sailing, you've definitely had a top section or a bottom section go at some stage.
Indeed. Yeah, there's a few more questions here. We might bring one up. There's one there I'll leave till the very end. But we have one here. It's an interesting question. What do you think is the future of the laser as an Olympic class?
It is a good question.
Yeah, it is a cheap boat. There's lots of them around the world. So I think one of the things about the Olympics is that everyone can do it and everyone can get involved. And I think we've seen this at the moment. I don't know if you know the double-handed. They're trying to bring in for Paris in 2024 a double-handed class, offshore class.
Yeah. I think that's on hold as of last week.
And I think one of the reasons it's on hold is because of the cost.
Yeah.
The cost of doing it.
Yeah, I think lasers will definitely they'd have a hard time taking them out, mostly because if you're a country that sailing really isn't a sport that's particularly popular, it's really cheap, it's affordable to get into. I mean, the cost of a laser Olympic campaign versus a campaign in one of the high performance classes like the NACRA or the 49er is it's almost peanuts in comparison. And even the cost, like a brand new 49er, you're looking at like north of 20 grand as far as I know, and compared to a laser from CH Marine is 7 or 7.5, or kind of changes around, but somewhere around there. So it's the kind of the cost is a big part of it, and just kind of the access. Like every sailing nation in the world seems to, the first class that they get into is the radial or is the laser. So I can't see it going anywhere anytime soon. Maybe one day it'll be changed to foiling, but I mean it's a pretty old design and it's still holding its own. So there's a lot to be said for that.
It stood the test of time, as you'd say.
Exactly.
That's great. Actually, another question I actually have for you. We're talking about transitioning from a radial to a standard. Do you have any advice for, how to say, as someone a little bit older, maybe not like Nick, because I'd say he'll be in the standard rig for a long time, but some of us who might be getting closer to an age where we might have to go the other way, go from a standard down to a radial. Any quick advice to someone there?
I don't know. I don't have any experience of it besides when I've been coaching radials and tried to hop in and have a race or two with some of the sailors. But I think really you could probably change your downhaul if you wanted to. You could change it back to the normal laser downhaul. And other than that, if you're getting to that stage, just make sure you're still enjoying it. It's probably the most important thing. you'll have bloody hard racing in the radial class, as hard if not harder than the full rigs.
Sure is. I don't like those start lines on the radial fleets at all. They're great fun at the provincial events. Yeah, indeed. Another question here we have from Glenn Fisher. When applying the kicker, what shape in the sail are you trying to achieve for the various directions and wind strength? So if you're putting on your kicker upwind, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to flatten the sail, are you? Or are
yeah,
you
so the kicker tightens up the leech and kind of helps to give the sail power. So it's kind of in really light winds, you'd be looking at kind of the main sheet taking kind of pulling most of the boom down. Your main sheet tension should be doing that. Then once you're kind of leaning out, like sailing upwind with your shoulders out a little bit, you should probably be splitting what's keeping the boom down between your main sheet and your kicker. And then as it increases a bit more, you're kind of just snugging the kicker to when you're going upwind. And then gradually you're just pulling it on more and more to help depower. And then it gets to a stage where at 50 knots, your kicker's a lot of the way on. And then after that, you're just really starting to pull that downhaul on quite hard. Versus in a radial, it's probably the opposite way around, in that you're maxing out the kicker pretty early, or at least pulling a lot of kicker on earlier, and then once it gets to really windy, you're fully just going as hard as you can out of it. Whereas there is a point really in the full rig where there's probably pulling on more kicker isn't really going to help too much. As you saw in the picture of where the boom was just completely bent, if you let the kicker off another little bit there, the clue of the sail is going to be in the exact same place. You're just putting more wear and tear on your boom.
And then if you're on a reach, you'd obviously just, what are you trying to do with your shape your sail? Just keep the power in it?
Or... Yeah, keep the power in it. So it probably depends on how tight or loose the reach is. You know, obviously if it's a tighter reach, you'd have a bit more kicker on. If it's looser, you can open the leech up and let it off a bit. And then if it's quite windy, my thing would be you'd probably want to go loose most of the time, just to prevent the boom hitting the water, because you've had a little bit too much heel when a gust has come. You've eased the sail and the boom hits the water, and next thing you know, you're over. So I would say when it's quite windy, just let it quite loose and just hike it out and play the main. But other than that, just kind of judge it off. The more downwind you're going on the reach, the looser it is, and the tighter it is, probably the more kicker. But definitely still less than when you're going upwind.
And finally, when you're going downwind or by the lee, you probably have your kicker at a certain setting, would you?
Yeah, by the lee, you if it's light winds by the lee, you have it max off, and then after that, by the lee, you definitely have it looser than when you're broad reaching, because the wind is coming from the leech of your sail going towards the luff, so you keep it nice and loose by the lee, and then if you're going on a broad reach, just pull it on kind of a couple of centimeters, I'd say, to kind of snug it off a little bit, and that then should keep the boom down a little bit more, because you've changed the flow of the wind over the sail to now be coming from the front towards the back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, that does indeed. Okay, no, I think if anyone else has more questions, please put them up. But I think we do have one more question here, and it might be a bit of a setup, but we'll ask it anyway. It's from Harry Durcan. And the question is, what's the best boat you've ever sailed? You can accept the radial, or is that
I rate the radial quite highly, to be honest. The full rig can be a bit of a handful. It's a bit painful. I rate the radial definitely as the best laser rig, and after that, the best boat I've sailed, it's a tough one. Probably
when you're surfing, were you? Earlier on.
I was windsurfing earlier. Yeah. Sailing still takes windsurfing though. Probably the 49er is a pretty kind of surreal experience a lot of the time, or maybe a moth as well is pretty cool. But the faster ones, but you definitely get the racing, the kind of the mental side to the tactics in laser sailing is very enjoyable, and I would say it's unmatched. So in terms of racing, one of my favorite boats to race is probably the full rig. And when I was younger, it was probably the radial.
Okay, great. All right then. Nick, do you have any other questions or anything else we need to add to it, or we covered most things, I think?
No, that was great. That was great, Johnny. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And Harry has just come back to you, by the way, ASL, and it just said he beat you in a laser event, and we never raced against each other back.
Yeah, we both did the laser nationals in Crosshaven when we were 12 or 13, and I think we were both Oppie kids. I think he came 4th and I came 6th or something like that, or maybe a bit further back. But he beat me by a couple of places anyway, and pretty much retired from the laser class there and then. So I went and did my laser sailing as a youth, and I was regularly reminded that Harry said I beat you there back. Anything you can do, I can do better. The twin relationship. So.
Well, a wise man, Harry. That's it. Get out while you're ahead. That's brilliant, Johnny. All right, listen, thanks very much for that, and thank you for joining us. That was brilliant. There is a recording of this, so it will be available, because I'd say lots of people are out enjoying the sunshine as well this evening, but we'll have this available for a few weeks. Thanks again, Johnny.
And, cool. No problem. Thank you very much.
And you are available, I'm sure, if anyone wants any advice.
Yeah, any questions at all, probably Facebook Messenger, or if you have my number, or Instagram, whatever, just type in my name, you'll find me. Send me a message. Don't be shy.
And you do a bit of coaching down in Cork, do you?
Yeah, I do a lot of work with the radials down in Crosshaven. So hopefully we'll be starting now. I think May Bank holiday is the plan, or maybe the following week or something like that, if restrictions allowing. I'm not really sure, but planning to get going as soon as we can, basically, is the plan.